The mornings on the farm always started the same. The air was cool, the mist hung low, and the sound of roosters carried across the fields. The man who owned the land had lived there all his life. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it was his home, a piece of earth passed down from his father, who had cleared these same fields with his bare hands. Every inch of soil held a story, and every sunrise reminded him that some things in life weren't meant to be bought or sold. His land stretched far enough that you could walk for 10 minutes and still see nothing but green and gold. Wheat swayed softly in the wind, and an old barn stood near the center, its red paint fading but strong. He took care of everything himself: the crops, the fences, and the few cows that still grazed near the creek. Life was simple, predictable, and peaceful. But peace never lasts long when money and ambition start creeping in. It began quietly, with a letter. It was neatly typed and sealed with a logo he didn't recognize. Inside it said the local homeowners association, a group that had recently taken over the newly built housing development nearby, wanted to discuss future land opportunities. He read it twice, not really understanding why they would contact him. His land wasn't for sale. It never had been. Still, he placed the letter on his kitchen table and went back to his chores, figuring it was just another real estate offer. But a week later, a second letter arrived. This one came with a brochure showing pictures of luxury homes, small planes, and words like community air access and private convenience. It sounded strange. Why would anyone want a runway here? This was farmland, not a city. When two men in suits knocked on his door the following Saturday, he already had a good guess about what they wanted. They introduced themselves politely, smiling too much and speaking too fast. They told him how his land was in a key location for their new community project, a private airstrip for residents who wanted easy access to their vacation homes. They said it would raise the area's value and benefit everyone. He listened quietly until they paused, then said, "This land isn't for sale. It never will be." They looked surprised, maybe even a little annoyed, but they stayed polite. One of them said, "You might want to think about it. Offers like this don't come twice." He nodded, but didn't reply. When they left, he watched their car disappear down the dirt road and shook his head. People from the city never understood what land meant out here. To them, it was just property. To him, it was life itself. For a few weeks, things went back to normal. He worked the fields, fixed the tractor, and spent evenings sitting on the porch listening to crickets. But then the noise started. Heavy trucks rolled down the nearby roads, engines roaring through the quiet nights. He saw surveyors marking the ground near his boundary with bright orange flags. He stopped one of them one morning and asked what they were doing. The young man looked nervous and said they were preparing for the community air project. The farmer told him he might be on private land. The surveyor nodded quickly, said he'd check, and drove off. It didn't stop. More vehicles came. The ground began to shake from machines clearing the nearby fields. Big signs went up announcing future site of community airport. His stomach sank. He had never signed anything, never sold, never agreed. How could they be building something like this so close to him? At first he tried to ignore it. Maybe it would stay on the other side of the property line. But when the noise and dust reached his crops, he knew it wasn't going away. He called the county office, but no one gave clear answers. One person said the HOA had approval for the project. Another said there might have been a zoning update. Each call ended with the same phrase, "We'll get back to you." No one ever did. One morning he walked down to the far edge of his land and froze. A section of his fence had been torn down and tire marks cut deep into his soil. Construction trucks were parked partly on his property, their wheels pressed into the soft earth that he'd plowed himself just days earlier. His chest tightened. He went straight to the site manager, who wore a hard hat and sunglasses and barely looked up from his clipboard. The farmer told him the trucks were trespassing. The man just said, "Sir, this is all within approved limits. You'll have to talk to the HOA office." Then he turned away. He did. The HOA office was a fancy building near the new housing development, with clean glass doors and polished floors. When he explained the problem, the receptionist smiled stiffly and told him to wait. After nearly an hour, a man in a gray suit came out and handed him a document. It said the HOA had been granted use of nearby land under a land improvement ordinance. He read it twice, confused. His property wasn't mentioned by name, but the map attached showed lines that seemed to overlap with his boundary. He pointed at the map and said, "That's my land." "This line here, it's wrong." The man just shrugged. "Everything's approved by the county," he said. "If you believe there's an error, you can file an appeal." An appeal? The word sounded useless. While he filed papers and waited for calls, the machines outside kept moving. Within weeks, a long strip of asphalt began to take shape not far from his barn. He could hear the constant pounding of construction from dawn to dusk. The cows grew restless. Birds stopped nesting near the edge of the property. Dust coated everything: the crops, the windows, the porch. Neighbors started talking too. Some said he should sell and move before it got worse. Others whispered that the HOA had powerful people behind them and that fighting them was pointless. He didn't listen. Every night he sat by his window, staring at the land he'd fought to keep all these years. He thought about his father's voice telling him, "Land remembers who takes care of it." That thought kept him steady, even when anger boiled inside him. Then came the first test flight. He heard the engines before he saw the plane, a small jet circling low, then landing on the nearly finished runway. He watched from a distance, hands clenched, heart pounding. It was real now. They had built an airport almost touching his field. The sound was deafening and the ground shook under his boots. The plane took off again and silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by old land papers and maps his father had left behind. Some were yellow with age, others marked with faded ink. He searched for anything that could prove his rights. He didn't know much about law, but he knew what was fair. He wasn't going to let them take what generations before him had protected. Days turned into weeks. The HOA announced plans to open the private airport soon. He got another letter, this time written more firmly, saying they expected cooperation from neighboring properties to ensure safety compliance. The tone made his blood boil. Cooperation? They had destroyed his fence, dug into his soil, and filled the air with noise. And now they wanted him to cooperate? He went to the county courthouse again. This time he refused to leave until someone helped him. After hours of waiting, an older clerk finally agreed to look at his property files. They sat in a quiet back room filled with dusty boxes. The clerk said softly, "You're not the first person to have trouble with that HOA." That gave him a small flicker of hope. She pulled out folders, old maps, and documents, things that hadn't been touched in years. He thanked her and promised to bring copies of everything home. When he returned to his farm that evening, he stood on the porch for a long time. The runway lights glowed faintly in the distance, blinking against the dark sky. It felt strange. His own land, once so quiet, now sharing space with something that didn't belong. He didn't know it yet, but inside those old papers was a secret the HOA had missed, something small written decades ago that would change everything later. For now, though, he just watched the horizon. The stars above the field were still there, same as they'd always been. No machine could take that away. He took a deep breath, the smell of earth and hay still strong, and whispered to himself, "They think they've won. But they don't know this land like I do." He went inside, turned off the lights, and sat quietly. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat, brushing against the soil that still belonged to him, at least for now. The days grew longer, and so did the noise. What had once been the sound of crickets and wind now turned into the echo of machines and metal. Trucks moved in and out all day, stirring dust that settled like fog over his crops. He tried to stay focused on his work, but it was impossible. Every time he looked toward the horizon, he saw more construction, more fences being moved, more ground being torn apart. The strange part was how fast everything happened. It was as if the rules didn't apply to them. Normally, a project like that would take months of permits and inspections, but the HOA seemed to move overnight. Signs went up, crews arrived, and before he knew it, his land was surrounded by orange cones and warning boards that read, "Authorized personnel only." He walked down one morning to check the far edge of his property. His boots sank slightly in the soft soil. When he reached the corner fence, he froze. It wasn't there anymore. Someone had removed it completely, not broken or damaged, but gone like it had never existed. Fresh tire tracks cut across the field, leading straight toward the construction zone. He felt anger rise in his chest. The fence had been there since his father built it, marking the line between what was his and what wasn't. It wasn't just wood and wire. It was a boundary, a symbol. Now it was gone. He marched straight toward the site. Workers turned their heads as he passed, their eyes full of hesitation. He didn't stop until he reached the man he recognized as the site manager, the same one he'd spoken to weeks earlier. The man looked up from his clipboard, expression blank. "You tore down my fence," the farmer said firmly. The manager sighed. "Sir, according to our records, that area falls within the project's designated development zone." "That's my land," the farmer said. "You can't just move into it. If you have documentation, you can take it up with the HOA office," the manager said. Turning away, he stood there for a moment, gripping the brim of his hat, trying to calm himself. The workers around him looked uneasy, some pretending to focus on their jobs. Finally, he said quietly, "You're making a mistake." But no one answered. That evening, he went back home and pulled out his land deeds. The papers were old but clear, the boundaries marked carefully, signed and notarized decades ago. He compared them to the new maps the HOA had shared in their letters. The lines didn't match. They had pushed their boundaries by at least 50 feet into his land. He drove to the county office again, determined to fix it. The receptionist at the front desk smiled politely but seemed uninterested. She handed him a form and told him to submit an appeal. He explained that construction was already happening on his property, but she just repeated, "You'll need to file an appeal." He filled out the form, submitted it, and waited. Days passed. Nothing changed. The trucks kept coming. Then one morning he woke to a strange sound, louder than anything before. It wasn't the hum of machines, but the roar of a plane engine. He ran outside and looked toward the site. A small jet was taxiing along the newly paved strip, moving fast before lifting off into the sky. He stood there, hands on his hips, watching it disappear into the clouds. The runway was active. Something inside him broke a little that day. Not because of the noise or the dust, but because it felt like no one cared. He was just one man against an entire system that seemed untouchable. Still, he refused to give up. He began documenting everything. He took pictures of the torn fence, the tire marks, the machines parked on his soil. He wrote dates and times in a small notebook, noting every noise, every disruption, every moment they crossed the line. He knew he needed proof, something solid he could use when the time came. At night, he barely slept. He sat by the window, watching the lights flicker across the half-built runway. His fields were dark, quiet, and small compared to the shining project beside them. The contrast made his heart ache. The next week, a man from the HOA came to his door. He was dressed in a crisp shirt and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "We understand this situation has been difficult," he said. "The development is for the greater good of the community. We'd like to offer you compensation for the inconvenience." The farmer stared at him. "You want to pay me for something you've already taken?" The man hesitated, then smiled. "We prefer to think of it as cooperation." He shook his head. "You people think money can buy everything, but you can't buy this land." The HOA representative sighed softly as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Then I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do. Construction will continue as planned." After he left, the farmer sat on his porch for a long time. The anger inside him burned hot, but he also felt something else, in a quiet determination. He had lived through droughts, floods, and hard seasons. He had lost crops, rebuilt barns, and kept going. This was just another storm. One evening, a neighbor stopped by. He was younger, someone who had sold a small piece of land to the HOA earlier. He parked his truck near the gate and walked up slowly, holding a cup of coffee. "They gave me a good price," he said softly. "I thought maybe I could help you talk to them again. Maybe make peace." The farmer shook his head. "You think peace comes from selling what's yours?" The younger man sighed. "You can't win against them. They've got lawyers and money. You're just one man." "Maybe," the farmer said quietly, "but I still have the truth. And I still have the papers." The neighbor nodded, unsure what to say. He looked at the fields, now half covered in dust, and said, "It used to be so quiet out here." Then he left. As weeks went by, the airstrip neared completion. The HOA started hosting tours for potential investors, bringing in people from outside the town. Expensive cars lined the temporary road leading to the site. He watched them from a distance, feeling like a ghost in his own home. One afternoon, he drove into town again. This time he asked to see the zoning records himself. After some resistance, an older county worker led him to a storage room, filled with thick folders and old maps. "It's all public record," the man said. but you'll have to dig through it yourself." He spent hours there, reading dusty papers and flipping through yellowed pages. He traced boundary lines, read land descriptions, and tried to find where the HOA's claim began. He found several documents referencing something called Land Improvement Ordinance, the same phrase used in the letter he'd been given. But it was vague, more about property upgrades and infrastructure than actual ownership. Still, something didn't feel right. The dates didn't line up. Some signatures looked fresh, too new for how long they claimed the ordinance had been active. It felt sloppy, rushed. When he left the building, the sun was already setting. The sky glowed orange over the town. He knew there had to be something deeper, some mistake or detail they had overlooked. But he didn't know what it was yet. At home, he laid all the documents on the table and studied them by lamplight. His father's old land deed sat at the center, its edges torn but still clear. Every time he looked at it, he felt a surge of strength. That piece of paper was more than ownership. It was history, legacy, and truth. The noise from the runway grew worse over the next few days. Planes came and went for testing, and the HOA even put up banners announcing an official opening soon. Local newspapers praised the development, calling it a modern achievement. None of them mentioned the man whose land had been swallowed in the process. One night, after a particularly loud flight shook his windows, he went outside. The stars were faint through the haze of construction lights. He stood by the empty spot where his fence used to be, and for the first time, he felt a deep calm instead of anger. He realized that if they could move this fast, they might have missed something, some detail hidden in the laws or paperwork. The thought stuck with him. He decided to visit the oldest section of the county records, the part no one ever bothered with anymore. Something told him the answer was buried there, forgotten by everyone except the land itself. He didn't know it yet, but that small decision, to look deeper instead of giving up, would be the turning point. The same HOA that had bulldozed his fence and ignored his words was about to learn that old land had old rules. Rules they had never even thought to check. That night, as he sat back down at the kitchen table, the air outside was still. The machines were quiet for once, resting for the next day. He looked out the window and whispered to himself, "If they think I'm finished, they're wrong." He didn't have power or money, but he had patience. And sometimes patience is the one thing that wins when everything else fails. The winter wind was sharp that morning, whistling through the cracks in the barn walls. The farmer pulled his coat tight and looked out over his land. The new runway sat like a scar across the horizon, gray against the brown fields. He could still see where his fence used to stand, where his father once planted the first row of wheat. Everything looked the same but felt different now. Colder, smaller, like someone had stolen the peace that used to live here. He had spent weeks fighting in silence. Every call to the county office ended with a promise that led nowhere. Every letter he sent came back with words like under review or beyond jurisdiction. It was clear no one wanted to help him. The HOA had money and connections, and most people in town didn't want to get involved. They said it wasn't their fight. But one morning after another restless night, he decided to go back to the county records building. Something deep inside him kept whispering that the answer was there, hidden in the old files no one bothered to read anymore. He packed a thermos of coffee, grabbed his folder of land papers, and drove into town. The records building was quiet and smelled of dust and old paper. A woman at the front desk barely looked up when he walked in. He asked if he could see the oldest land ordinances on file, not just the recent zoning maps, but the really old ones. She frowned, said it would take time, then led him down a narrow hallway into a storage room filled with boxes stacked to the ceiling. "You'll find what you're looking for somewhere in here," she said with a small shrug. No one's touched most of these in decades. When she left, he stood for a moment, surrounded by silence. The room was dim and dust floated in the air like smoke. He started opening boxes, reading faded labels one after another. Hours passed. Most of what he found was useless. Old tax receipts, road plans, and forgotten building permits. But then, at the bottom of a box marked Historical Land Use 1950-1960, he found a thin folded document sealed in plastic. He pulled it out carefully and laid it on the table. The paper was yellowed, but the ink was still clear. Across the top it read, County Ordinance Number 47B, enacted 1957. His eyes moved down the page, line by line, until he found, What made his heart stop? It said that any land within a certain boundary, and specifically properties that were originally registered as agricultural under the old district law, could not be used for commercial aviation purposes without the written consent of the original landholder or their direct heirs. He read it again and again to be sure he wasn't imagining it. His farm, his exact land, was part of that original agricultural zone. The HOA's fancy project sat right in the middle of it. For a long moment, he just stared at the page, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. After all their money, their lawyers, and their threats, the HOA had missed something simple, something old, but still valid. He folded the paper back carefully, tucked it into his folder, and drove home. The road blurred under the sunlight, but his mind was sharp now, focused. The fight wasn't over, not even close. When he got home, he made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with all his papers spread out. He compared the ordinance to his land deed, tracing the boundary lines with a pencil. Everything matched perfectly. His property was clearly within the protected area. Still, he wanted to be sure. The next morning, he visited a retired county clerk who lived just outside town, an old friend of his father's. The man was slow to answer the door, but when he heard what the farmer was looking for, his eyes lit up. "Oh, I remember that ordinance," the old clerk said, pulling out his reading glasses. "We put it in place after a bunch of private air companies tried to build in these parts back in the 50s. Folks didn't want planes disturbing their land or their livestock, so it's still valid," the farmer asked. The clerk nodded. "Far as I know, no one ever repealed it. It's old law, but it still stands. These new people don't bother reading the old books anymore." That sentence stayed with him. They don't bother reading the old books anymore. He thanked the man, promised to visit again, and left. For the first time in months, he felt something close to hope. But he knew he had to be careful. If the HOA found out too soon, they'd bury it in paperwork before he could act. So he decided to keep quiet. He spent the next few weeks gathering proof. He took photos of his land, copies of every page from the ordinance, and old letters showing his family's ownership history. He even visited 2 of his oldest neighbors who remembered when the county first passed the rule. They signed statements confirming that his land had always been part of that protected zone. Meanwhile, the HOA continued as if nothing was wrong. Construction workers paved the final section of the runway. The board held meetings boasting about the new community airport that would bring prosperity to the area. Local newspapers wrote glowing articles. He read every word in silence, knowing something they didn't. Each day that passed made their investment deeper and his leverage stronger. He didn't rush to court. He wanted them to finish everything first, to spend every last dollar before realizing their mistake. So he waited. From his porch, he watched them install lights, hang signs, and build a small terminal building near the edge of the runway. At night, when the work lights glowed in the distance, he would sip his coffee and smile to himself. They thought he was beaten, but the truth was the opposite. The land was patient, and so was he. As spring came, the airstrip was nearly complete. The HOA announced a grand opening ceremony for their private airport, with local officials and investors invited. Flyers were mailed out and banners hung along the main road. It was all over the news. He went to town the day before the event, filing one final set of papers at the courthouse, copies of the 1957 ordinance, his land deed, and a legal notice of violation against the HOA for unauthorized commercial activity on restricted agricultural property. The clerk at the desk looked confused, but she stamped the documents and handed him a copy. On the morning of the opening, the farmer woke early. The sky was clear, the wind calm, perfect flying weather. Cars began streaming down the road toward the new airport. He could hear the distant chatter of music and laughter even from his porch. He sat quietly watching. Reporters gathered around the ribbon-cutting area. The HOA president gave a long speech about progress, community growth, and innovation. Then, just as the crowd clapped and the first private jet prepared to land, 2 county vehicles pulled onto the site. He could see it from his porch, the official stepping out, holding papers. The crowd started murmuring. Within minutes, the music stopped and the plane circled overhead instead of landing. The county officers spoke to the HOA representatives, then taped a bright orange notice on the gate. The words "cease and desist order" could be seen from the road. He didn't smile, not yet. He just sat there, breathing slowly, watching the scene unfold. People looked confused, some angry. The fancy guests began to leave. The HOA president argued with the officials, waving his arms, but it was no use. The county had confirmed the ordinance, the one they'd all missed. That evening, after the crowd was gone and the lights at the runway went dark, the farmer finally allowed himself a small grin. He didn't celebrate loudly or boast. He simply whispered to himself, "Told you this land remembers." The next day, a local reporter came by, asking if he wanted to make a statement. He politely refused. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about the rules they forgot to follow." But deep down he felt something stronger than pride, justice. The kind of justice that takes time, that grows slow like roots underground. He knew the fight wasn't completely over. The HOA would try to argue, maybe even appeal. But this time the law was on his side. At night the sky was finally quiet again. No machines, no planes, no lights. Just the sound of wind moving gently through the grass. The land looked peaceful, almost like it was thanking him. He thought of his father then, the man who had once told him, "Don't let anyone rewrite the story of your land." He smiled softly. The old man would have been proud. The fight had taken its toll. But now, for the first time in a long while, he could rest knowing that the ground beneath his feet still belonged to him, and to the generations that came before. He turned off the porch light and went inside. Tomorrow he would start planning his next move. The HOA wasn't finished yet, but neither was he. And this time, he wasn't just a farmer. He was the man who had found the law they all forgot. The morning after the meeting at the town hall, the farmer woke up before sunrise. He had barely slept. His mind kept replaying the looks on the faces of the HOA board members when he'd mentioned the missing ordinance. There had been a flicker of confusion and something that looked a lot like fear. That tiny detail gave him a reason to keep fighting. He went out to his porch and looked toward the horizon. The half-finished airport stretched like a scar across his land, his old grazing fields now buried under concrete and steel. He felt anger rising in his chest, but he also knew anger wouldn't win this battle. He needed to stay calm, smart, and one step ahead of the people who thought they could bully him into silence. He made himself a strong cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunrise. The smell of fresh soil and dew filled the air. For a moment he remembered how peaceful this place used to be. Cows wandering near the barn, the sound of birds, the smell of freshly cut hay. Those memories grounded him. They reminded him of why this fight mattered. By mid-morning he had a plan. He loaded a few documents into his old pickup truck and drove to the county recorder's office. The lady at the counter had seen him many times before. She gave him a tired but kind smile. "Back again?" she asked softly. "Yeah," he said. "I'm looking for something, anything, that mentions zoning changes in the last 2 years, specifically near Ridgeway Road." She nodded and led him to the records room. He spent hours going through old files, scanning every line, every date. His fingers were covered in dust from flipping through so many folders. Finally, he found something odd. A document had been modified 6 months ago. It changed the land use classification of several parcels, including his own. But what caught his attention wasn't what was added. It was what was missing. The ordinance that should have allowed that modification was never officially recorded. The document had been stamped, but not signed by the state authority. That meant legally it wasn't valid. He felt a rush of excitement. It was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle. He carefully made copies of everything and tucked them safely in a folder. Before leaving, he double-checked the dates and signatures. Everything lined up perfectly with the timeline of the HOA's airport project. On the drive home, the wind whipped through the open window. For the first time in months, he felt hopeful. He knew he still had a long road ahead, but now he had proof. And proof was power. That evening, he called a local reporter who had covered a few of the earlier disputes. She was hesitant at first. Stories about zoning and ordinances didn't usually make headlines. But when he mentioned the words illegal construction and public land misuse, her tone changed instantly. "Can you show me the documents?" She asked. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Come to my farm. You'll see it all." The next day, she arrived with her camera and a small notepad. They sat at his kitchen table, papers spread out between them. She read every line, asked dozens of questions, and finally looked up at him with wide eyes. "This is huge," she said quietly. "If this checks out, they could be forced to shut the entire project down." He nodded slowly. "That's all I want. For them to follow the rules same as everyone else." She promised to verify the documents and start her own investigation. As she left, he watched her car disappear down the road. The weight on his shoulders felt lighter. But deep down, he knew the HOA wouldn't take this quietly. Within days, whispers started spreading around town. People stopped him at the grocery store or at the diner, asking if it was true that the airport wasn't legal. Some were curious, some were supportive, but a few gave him looks filled with quiet warnings, as if to say, "Be careful." Then one evening, as he was closing the barn door, a black SUV pulled up near his gate. Two men stepped out. They weren't from around there. Clean suits, polished shoes, and cold eyes. One of them called out, "You're making a lot of noise." "Maybe it's time to stop." The farmer didn't answer. He just stared back at them, his jaw tight. After a few seconds, they got back into their car and drove away. That night, he couldn't sleep again. He sat at his desk looking at the pile of papers. Fear crept into his mind, but he pushed it away. He'd faced storms, droughts, and debts. He wasn't going to back down from a few threats. A few days later, the reporter's article went live. The headline read, "HOA Airport Project Under Fire. Missing Ordinance Could Invalidate Construction." The story spread quickly. Local radio stations picked it up. Social media buzzed with comments, some defending the HOA, others demanding accountability. Suddenly, people who had ignored him before were now calling to offer support or information. The county office announced an emergency review of the airport project. Inspectors arrived, cameras followed, and the board members who had once brushed him aside were now scrambling to explain themselves. One of them even came to his house, pretending to be friendly. "Let's work something out," the man said. "There's no need to drag this out in public." But the farmer just shook his head. "You had plenty of chances," he replied. "Now it's out of my hands." The following week, an official letter arrived from the County Development Authority. It stated that all construction was to be halted immediately pending review of zoning violations. The site was sealed off and workers were sent home. The farmer stood at his fence watching the machinery sit silent under the afternoon sun. It was a strange feeling, and part victory, part disbelief. Months of struggle had led to this moment, yet it still didn't feel real. As he looked across the land, he thought about how close they had come to erasing his history. The fields his grandparents had worked, the soil that had fed generations. It was all nearly gone. But somehow one missing ordinance had stopped it. That night he received a message from the reporter. "They're furious," she wrote. "But you did the right thing. This isn't over, though. They'll try to find a loophole." He smiled faintly and typed back, "Then I'll be ready." The next morning he drove into town to meet with a local attorney who had offered to help. Together they went over every document again, preparing for whatever might come next. The lawyer explained that the HOA might appeal, or even try to push a new ordinance through the county council to make their project legal retroactively. But the farmer had learned patience from years of working the land. "They can try," he said, "but I'll be here watching every step." As they wrapped up, the lawyer looked at him with respect. "You've done something most people wouldn't have the courage to do," he said. "You stood up to a machine that thought it could crush you." The farmer just shrugged. "I didn't do it to be brave," he said. "I did it because this land is my life." Outside, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in soft orange light. The sound of crickets filled the air. He paused for a moment before heading back home, breathing in the calm evening air. For the first time in a long while, he felt peace settling inside him, even if it was only temporary. He knew there was still one part left to this fight. The HOA wasn't finished, and neither was he, but now he wasn't just one man against a system. The whole town was watching, and for the first time the truth was on his side. Weeks passed since the construction stopped. The airport site, once busy with workers and machines, now stood silent. The wide concrete runway stretched across the land like an unfinished scar. The farmer often drove by it just to remind himself that he wasn't dreaming. He had actually done it, he had stopped them, but deep down he knew it wasn't over. Things like this never ended quietly. People who had that much money and pride didn't just walk away. He went about his days like normal, fixing the fences, checking on the soil, and trying to bring life back to the part of the land that wasn't destroyed. Yet every time he saw a letter in his mailbox with an official seal, his stomach tightened. One morning it happened. A letter from the HOA's legal team arrived. It was thick, neatly folded, and full of legal language that seemed designed to confuse. But one line stood out clear. They were appealing the county's decision. They claimed the missing ordinance was a clerical error, and that the construction should be allowed to continue under good faith development. He sat at his kitchen table, holding the paper in silence. For a moment it felt like all the air had left the room. They weren't giving up. They were just getting started. He called the lawyer who'd been helping him and read out the letter. The lawyer sighed. "I was expecting this," he said. "But don't panic. We'll fight it. They're trying to make it sound simple, but it's not. They knew the rules, they just thought no one would notice." The farmer nodded slowly. "What do I need to do?" "Keep your records safe," the lawyer said. "And don't talk to them directly. Everything goes through me now." Over the next few weeks, things turned tense again. The HOA board started holding meetings behind closed doors. Rumors floated around town. Some said the board was trying to push through a new ordinance to make the airport legal retroactively. Others said they planned to sue him personally for delaying the project and causing financial damages. But something unexpected started happening too. People from the community, farmers, small shop owners, neighbors who had stayed quiet before, began showing up at his gate. Some brought coffee or pies, others just words of support. One old man who lived down the road said, "You're fighting for all of us, son. They think they can take whatever they want. You showed them they can't." Those words stayed with him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was standing alone. The reporter came back too. She had been following every twist of the story. "They're feeling the pressure," she told him one afternoon. "I've been getting anonymous tips, documents showing they skipped other steps too. It's not just your land they mishandled. This goes deeper." The farmer leaned forward, surprised. "You mean they've done this before?" "Seems like it," she said. "But this time they picked the wrong person to push around." The county hearing for the HOA's appeal was scheduled for the end of the month. The farmer spent days preparing with his lawyer. They went over every document again and again. Maps, signatures, letters, even old county records. When the day came, the courthouse was packed. The HOA's lawyers arrived first, sharp suits and polished smiles, carrying stacks of binders. Then the farmer walked in wearing his old jacket and boots. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to tell the truth. The hearing lasted hours. The HOA's lawyer spoke first, arguing that the airport project was meant to benefit the community, and that halting it caused irreversible economic harm. He used words like progress, modernization, and regional opportunity. Then it was the farmer's turn. He stood up slowly, papers trembling a little in his hands. He wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people, but once he started, his voice grew steadier. "I'm not against progress," he said, "but progress isn't supposed to destroy what came before it. They didn't ask. They didn't follow the law. They just came onto my land and started building like it already belonged to them. If I made a mistake on my property, they'd fine me. But when they break the rules, they call it an error. That's not right." The room went quiet. Even the board members who had been whispering before stopped talking. The judge asked a few questions about the missing ordinance, and the county clerk confirmed on record that it had never been signed or approved. That small detail, one missing signature, was enough to make the HOA's entire project legally unstable. By the end of the hearing, everyone could feel the shift. The HOA lawyers looked nervous, whispering among themselves. The farmer sat quietly, hands folded, just waiting. A few days later, the county released its final decision. The HOA's appeal was denied. The airport construction permit was officially revoked. The board was fined for violating zoning laws and ordered to restore parts of the land to its original condition. The news spread quickly through town. People celebrated quietly, but for the farmer it didn't feel like a party. It felt like justice, simple, quiet justice. That evening, he walked back to the edge of his field. The wind moved gently through the tall grass that had started growing again. He stood there for a long time, watching the sunset paint the sky.